Really interesting way to track the development of ideas across history is to look at the architecture. Now, the architecture is going to have a bit of a lag as compared to the ideas that bear fruit in architecture, but I mean, that's going to be the limitation of any kind of system you use to determine when ideas are being propagated and had. But architecture is very long lasting, and it's also very telling because up to, well, with the exception of only a few periods in history, people build architecture without thinking about the underlying mental technologies that allow them to do so. And so it's very honest. The architecture is very honest about what it is. It just is the product of the capacities uh, to conceive of possible realities that are actually available to the people building. And I was recently reminded of this because I saw that in like the 1300s, there were skyscrapers in essentially in Bologna. This was right after the investiture conflict, um, and which is, of course, when the Pope in Rome and all of the local uh, political figures, and at that time, what would be considered the pretty much the entire globe was fighting over who was allowed to make appointments for religious positions, and the result of that conflict um, was an agreement, concordat of Worms and one other concordat I forget from a earlier period, I believe, that stripped a lot of the rights away from the nobility to choose the the religious leaders, and the resulting infrastructure in Bologna. Now, I'm correlating these two. You don't have to, but I'm correlating them because it seems to me like what they built were steeples without churches, without the sacred space associated with the steeple. And the result of them building this was what essentially looked like a modern cityscape. And if my hypothesis concerning the development of concepts being directly correlated with the production of various forms of infrastructure, then that tells us something very interesting about where our modern infrastructure format came from and when it came from, uh, what type of environment uh, resulted in it. Now, part of the reason that it's that there's this part of the reason that nobody really knows why the skyscrapers were used is because I don't think they knew when they built them. This is one of the interesting effects from architecture being so closely tied to ideology, is that when people build uh, architecture, they build it because they can, because they have the conceptual technology available to them to actually see how they could build it. But they don't necessarily, and actually, I think almost universally, don't have any idea how that new space that they're creating is actually to be used. That's not that's not even on their minds at that point. They're just like, we can make a new space. Now, making a new space um, is a kind of cleansing, and it's like you can think of it like a chemical agent that clears out all of the old habits and rituals that you would have done and makes it impossible, nearly impossible for those rituals to occur in the new space. And that new space, since the old rituals are all cleared out, what it makes is it puts a premium on new ritual behaviors that can inhabit that space, and basically causes specialization. It causes a new set of habits and rituals that can go on in that space than ever existed before in history. So the building of these spaces precedes the production of the kind of things that'll inhabit the spaces. That's why they built the steeples. Nobody knew what they were for, but now we build the steeples without churches everywhere, and we know exactly what they're for before we even build them. Is because we now have developed the culture to be able to properly inhabit those structures. And I think this is really interesting, especially considering one of the most expensive buildings on the planet recently was the construction of that circular building for the Apple campus, which is a very, very different kind of construction than pretty much anything we've seen since. Uh, it's reminiscent of various things in the past, but I think it's very indicative of a mindset that is in Apple and not a lot of other places in the world right now, which we saw on display when Apple decided not to give backdoors to the FBI when they asked for it for a device that was connected to a potential terrorist. That the idea that they have is of creating a completely sacred interior space, the space that's completely cut off from the exterior, and that's what they're doing in their devices, and it's also what they do with the Apple Circle is they're creating this completely cut off central space. And um, and and that's unique and frustrating for a lot of Apple employees, I've heard, who keep on walking into doors because they're all made of glass and stuff like that. But it's that new space. It seems kind of ridiculous right now because we don't have the habits to actually know how to inhabit it correctly. But I think it's going to become a lot more popular to have that kind of garden in the center, and in order to get to the garden, you have to go through the walls, which are the part that you inhabit. Um, and because that is it's a reflection of the garden aspect instead of the tower, like instead of the steeple aspect of a church. It's a reflection of uh the sacred aspect, the body of the church, the sacred space, a reflection of the Garden of Eden, you can say. So I mean, this is why I love the architectural side of things, is because you can trace ideas through the architecture, and it not only tells you something about the ideas and tells you something about the architecture, but it tells you when and for what it can be like solidly, actually, physically used for, which I think is something that doesn't happen a lot in the idea world. Is people keep on throwing around universals and nobody ever knows what to do with them. No, architecture knows what to do with it way before anybody else does, and they put it to action, and then what comes out of it is these new spaces for people to experience and grow in and play with, and people love that. Like that's where the almost I think that's where the creation of value is in creating those spaces. Like figuring out what to do in those spaces, that's all about what economics is. It's like figuring out what to do inside of those spaces. But that's really a bad focus for economics, because the focus should be on how to create more of those spaces. Because even if you create an environment like capitalism does, it creates an environment specifically to promote the growth of specific forms of, uh, you could call it the architecture of industry, and those are essentially uh, sacred spaces. Businesses are like little separated off culverts. They act and behave differently on the inside than all the rest of the society is capable of doing, and that produces things that the rest of society cannot. And that's what creates the value. So it's really like we should always be focusing, well, at least now in the time of skyscrapers, we should all pay very close attention to these creations of separated off spaces. And this actually has a lot to do with the current season we're in of Christmas, because as Mr. Paggio recently put out a video on the subscribers only section, but it was about Santa Claus, Saint Nicholas, and also the darker aspects. And this is really good because this is what creating one of those separated spaces is all about. Is there's an inside and there's an outside. There's a Santa Claus and there's a Krampus, you know, that and how do you know which one is which? But also like that's what choosing is all about. Creating these spaces is choosing something, and the differentiation between Santa or Saint Nick and one of the darker figures is have you differentiated yourself rightly? You know, is your is the are the things that you have chosen to select for, are those good or bad? And right now in modernity, there's almost no way to select for good versus bad, which is why Apple is as big as it is, and also why some of its decisions are so controversial. Even with Paggio himself saying that there's symbolism of 666 and all this inside of Apple. Well, it's because they're choosing in a period of time when we don't know, like as a culture, as a society, as a human group, we don't know how to select without accidentally including the bad and excluding the good. We don't know how to select anymore. And that's all what Christ incarnate is about. Is if Christ becomes man, now there's a criterion for selection. And that's why we have Santa Claus, is because now we have the capacity to select for and against things based on criteria that actually results in the bad being excluded and the good being included. Before Christ's incarnation and birth, that was uh, pretty much impossible. And in a post-Christ period where nobody believes, that it's also impossible. It only occurs in an incarnational setting, which is, hopefully what is brought about this Christmas, as an incarnational setting where good and evil begin to be separated. And, you know, there's going to be some good and some bad things that come out of that. But I think Apple's on the right track with the way they built that building. And I think we're going to see a lot more things like this. A lot of new infrastructure, a lot of new kinds of architecture popping up as a result of the conceptual changes that are beginning.